Welcome to this week's Who the Folk podcast, sponsored by Darla Cashin of RBC Wealth Management. I'm Lonnie Goldsmith, the editor of TC Jewfolk. This week I talked to Alejandro Baer, the director of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the University of Minnesota. We talk Minnesota's social studies standards, growing up Jewish in Spain, and the impact of memory on this week's Who the Folk podcast. Alejandro Baer, welcome to this week's Who the Folk podcast. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you. It's an honor to be on Who the Folk.
Thank you. Happy to have you here. So you are the director of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the University of Minnesota. And there's a lot of things I'd like to talk with you about as it relates to that. But perhaps the biggest, most newsworthy thing at the moment is the Minnesota Department of Education's decision, at least at this point, to eliminate references to the Holocaust from the social studies curriculum draft that's being approved over the course of the next couple of years. How does this decision as it stands, hurt the work that you do at the U and in your position?
Well, I think at this point, it's not hurting the work. We're only in the initial stages, and this is the first draft that has been submitted for consideration. Now there is a process where the community can provide input and feedback, and the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, together with our friends and partners at the Jewish Community Relations Council, we have put together a letter directed to the Minnesota Department of Education, with the subject heading Help Restore Holocaust and Genocide Education in Minnesota. This is a letter that also anybody can actually send from their ends if they're concerned about this absence, which is it's a worrisome absence, given that the social studies standards that we had, these are reviewed every 10 years. The previous ones had two mentions to the Holocaust in the standards. But I would say that we at the center, and I think also JCRC, we are optimistic about the satisfactory outcome. Kind of feedback and impression we're getting from MDE is that this was an oversight that occurred while they were transitioning from the existing standards to the current ones, and we know that they're looking at this very closely. They're already getting feedback from members of the community, from other organizations, institutions, from professors that are invested in Holocaust and genocide education, and we're confident that the Holocaust and also other genocides in 20th century and 21st century history will appear in the standard. So I think this oversight should be addressed in the next draft that will be available. We think it's in February or March. So I'm overall, of course, we're somewhat concerned because it's somewhat symptomatic. But I would not, but as I said, I think we can be confident that there will be an outcome that is satisfactory, and we're doing what we need to do, is to raise attention on this matter and bring it up to those who are involved in creating the standards, which is the standards committee and MD who's overseeing the process.
You know, one of the questions that that I think people have asked me is, and I've tried to calm them down, and having talked with folks at the JCRC about this is, yes, it's alarming, but it seems like it's, it's early in the process, I guess, is the sort of the bottom line. And yes, while it's alarming now, it's something that can be corrected. Is that sort of the message you'd have for people?
Yes, that's exactly the message. But still, I think it's important that people are aware of this and also support this effort for inclusion. our colleague George Dalbo has put together a set of recommendations and suggestions. George Dalbo is a former outreach coordinator of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, and now he's also social study. He has been a social studies teacher for a long time, and so with his help, we have made that suggestion of where in the current standards the Holocaust can be included, Holocaust and other genocides. And we have, from the center, we have a rather broad approach, since the question would be, which other genocides do you include? And we use the term genocide and human rights relation as a term that encompasses and that will allow for other genocides to be taught as well in the schools, whether it's the Armenian genocide or the Ukrainian famine genocide of the 1930s, and others. From the center, it's also important, and we, in the letter that we have co-signed with Steve, we praise MDE for the first time including in the current standards an explicit language about the genocide of native population in Minnesota. And so we have to take that into consideration. We have to welcome this important change, which is actually a breakthrough. But on the other hand, this should not come at the cost of leaving out the Holocaust and other genocides. This is not a zero-sum game. And in also the kind of pedagogical approach that we have at the center, we think that including specifically a language about the Holocaust, genocides, and human rights relations, and this is in line with many of our colleagues across the country, institutions that are teaching about the Holocaust, starting from the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. The Holocaust provides actually one of the most effective and extensively documented subjects for pedagogical examination of basic moral issues of civics, about democratic institutions, how they need to be appreciated, how they need to be nurtured, protected, how silence and indifference to suffering of others or to the infringement of civil rights perpetuate the problems. These are important lessons that are contained in Holocaust and genocide education. So this is the message we want to convey, and I think it's coming across. There is agreement on this, and it should not be a matter of contention.
You know, and it's interesting that, you know, sort of what you had talked about there, and I know this is something that when I was part of the group from TCG Folk that was lucky enough to get to interview Governor Walz a couple of months ago for one of our other podcasts, he had talked about the idea of not putting on his hat as a social studies teacher, which he was, and somebody who has studied extensively the Holocaust and Holocaust education is about not teaching the Holocaust in a vacuum. And I think that's really important, is you talking about the degradation of democratic norms that sort of led to the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany, is that there are lessons to be learned from that as to how to not let those things take root now, 75 odd years later.
Yes, exactly. I think there are different approaches to Holocaust education, and I think it's also important to have that clear. It's from a university, or what we can expect from a social studies standards of the state of Minnesota is not necessarily exactly the same that what is taught in a Jewish institution or in a Jewish day school or in a synagogue, and that's of course normal. Also, the Ukrainian American community will teach about their genocide differently. It has to do with their identity, it has to do with religion, it has to do with family history, and all of that affects as well the kind of the pedagogical approach. We, from the University of Minnesota, we take more of a universalistic approach and think of how can this history be meaningful and have universal implications beyond those that were or are directly affected by the genocides, by the ethnic or religious communities that have a strong tie to these historical events. And these are the kind of civic lessons that we can learn by studying, by examining this history. And I'll give you an example. We're fortunate to count with Holocaust survivors here in the community in Minnesota, and I want to mention Dora Seidenweber, who has been incredibly generous and committed to the work of Holocaust education, and she has come very often, I would say almost every year since I'm here in Minnesota, to my classes. And when she tells her story, which is definitely, it's a family story, it's a personal story, that resonates with everyone in the room. And it resonates particularly with those that are children of refugees, that have a history of hardship, of a background, of an origin where they had to leave the country, where there was violence, where there's loss, and also adaptation to a new cultural background. So these are also universal lessons that are more at the level, I mean, this is not civics or politics, this is more at the level of the human experience. And that's important to emphasize as well. I want to thank from here Dora for being so strong, because she's in an age where this is a big effort, and for being so committed in teaching these lessons, or helping us to teach these lessons in our classrooms.
Well, and I think it's great that there is that community of survivors who are willing to get out and to tell their stories and the lessons from it, because obviously those are very important to pass on, because as has been said, we're getting a lot of years on from the Holocaust, and the survivor population is sadly dwindling. And so the opportunity to hear that firsthand knowledge and those firsthand stories and those firsthand lessons, we're running out of time.
Yes, and we've also made an effort over the last years to record survivor testimony. We know that other institutions here in the Twin Cities have also done that, like the JCRC. We've worked with them also on many efforts in programming and in education. We are fortunate to have counted with many survivors here in the Twin Cities that were willing to give testimony. And one of the projects that we have online on our website is Portraying Memory, which is an art project where artist Felix de la Concha, and I invite the listeners to click on that project on our YouTube channel. So we have these testimonies at the same time the artist is portraying the survivors. And some of these survivors are not with us anymore. So in that sense, it's also an homage to them, for their resilience and for the commitment. And it's a tool that stays there for educators and just for memory in a broader sense.
And we'll include a link to that in the show notes and in the article, because obviously I think it's important. It's an important exhibit for people to see and get to learn more about. But switching gears a little bit, Alejandro, I wanted to ask, how did you get started in this field to begin with?
Well, I guess it has to do with a little bit with my family background. Not I guess, I'm quite sure that's the case. I come from a family of German Jewish refugees who immigrated to Argentina in the 1930s. My father was still born in Germany, in a small town in the Palatinate region, in the western region, close to the French border. And so I grew up with these stories of displacement, of growing up in a community that spoke German, but whose link to actual Germany was non-existent, because there were no relatives in Germany anymore. So this is probably the background that led me to have an interest in memory. And I would say that that's my main focus in research is memory studies. The question of how do we remember past violence, how those memories constitute our identity, who we are, how we relate to others, how memories can facilitate processes of coming to terms with the past, but also how memories can also be obstacles and can hinder relations with other communities and can actually perpetuate animosities and hostilities. We see that in many different contexts, and that's an area I'm very interested in exploring. Part of my research is on Spain and the legacies of the Civil War and these divides that continue to exist even 70, 80 years after the events. Argentina and the so-called dirty war, state terrorism that took place there. I'm interested in exploring these questions, but I think the reason I'm interested in that is because I was directly affected by questions of memory and of identity. The question of who are we and how much are we constituted by these events in history.
So you're telling me before we started recording that you grew up in Madrid in Spain. How long have you been in Minnesota?
I've been here now since the summer of 2012.
Okay,
8 years here in Minnesota. Yeah.
So how much did growing up in Franco, Spain, did that? I guess how much of obviously there's a lot of you mentioned the Spanish Civil War. There's a lot of pain that was caused by Franco. How has that affected sort of your career path in some of the specific areas you've chosen to study?
Well, I grew up in post-Franco Spain because I was a little child.
Okay.
When we arrived from Argentina to Spain, this was 1973, and I was born 1970. So those years are very blurred in my memory.
I apologize for aging you that much. Then I'm sorry.
No, that's
not my
fine.
intent.
No, my age. That's fine. I might look much older than what I actually am. Not a problem. So anyway. So, but definitely post-Franco Spain this was a society that was really struggling and with the wounds of an extremely violent past, of an extremely violent dictatorship that followed the Civil War, 40 years of dictatorship. And then the transition in Spain was a sort of it was not a clean break with the past. It was a transition coordinated, we might say, from above, from the very regime itself that slowly started to dismantle its main institutions, but where the main individuals remained in positions of power. So it was sort of a controlled transition, and Spain over the years, and if we look back on the kind of struggles and tensions that have to do with regional separatism, Catalonia, with also the social question that and a stark divide between left and right. These are somehow the after effects of a transition that did not achieve really its goals to an extent that the problems are still there. There was no truth commission, there were no trials, there was no justice, impunity prevailed for decades. And of course, that's a question that many Spaniards ask themselves, whether that transition to democracy that it was touted as being exemplary to others was really that model. And by now, I think that many think that this was probably not the case, that there were many pending tasks, many things that were not really addressed. And when a past is not addressed, it somehow always will emerge. No? It's like the trauma, no, that can be repressed, but it will always come up again and pose those questions and be unsettling.
One of the things that I found, you don't want to make this, too political or anything, but there's a lot of things that at least have been sort of circulated around on Facebook and Twitter and throughout social media, are sort of the ways that the lessons of the Holocaust and of Nazism maybe are, you talked about sort of the institutions and institutional norms the sort of the takeover of those. People are trying to link some of that to what's gone on in the United States in terms of surrounding the election last month. Is that too big of a leap to make? That feels a lot.
Well, the question is, the question we need to ask is what is actually being compared. And when we talk about the Holocaust, we're talking about a historical process that most scholars will situate 1938, and others it starts 1941 with the invasion of the Soviet Union, the beginning of the mass killings. So, but we can speak about Nazism, of course, with the rise of Hitler, and I mean when Hitler won the election in January 1933. So it depends where are you like anchoring the comparison, and I think it's not far-fetched if you look at the Weimar Republic and the threats to democracy, the kind of concessions that were made at that time, or the kinds of alliances between conservative and fascists. All these things are, that's what history is there for, is we have to draw some lessons from that. We cannot say this is just incomparable. Of course, it doesn't make any sense to say something like, we kind of compare extermination camps with I don't know, just I don't want to even go there with cases that have nothing to do with that. Right. But there's part in that historical process that led to the Holocaust, that led to the extermination camps that have to do with the falling apart of the undermining of democratic institutions, the disrespect for the basic norms of coexistence, the stigmatizing and discriminating. I mean, these was the anteroom of what followed, and I'm all in favor of invoking that as warning signs when we see similar things, when we see similar processes and phenomena taking place here in the U.S. or in other countries across the world.
Okay, it's interesting. I just get, I think, I get a little, worried about any time you evoke the Holocaust as a comparison to things. And I'm just, I don't know how I feel about that. But, and I suppose you're right. It depends on where I guess what your starting point is.
Yes, I think we have to be specific on that. And, just playing the Nazi card or the Stalin or the Stalin card, it's very often used as well. Mm-hmm. Can be just a part of political rhetoric, and it's important to be cautious on that. As scholars, we say, okay, this is the question: what are you exactly comparing? Let's look at these processes and let's see if we can learn, if we can draw a lesson from this past that is helpful to shed light on the current circumstance. And there's no lack, there's no shortage of current circumstances where we have to these are definitely red flags, and it's important to point to them.
No, I agree. It's it just becomes a slippery slope, obviously, and and I think we've seen a lot of that over the course of the summer. Like around the mask mandates and some of the things that the quarantining and sheltering in place kind of things, the comparisons made, a mask mandate to wearing the yellow star that was made a lot in social media. It just seemed like just an out of line comparison.
Well, that's that's an absurdity. That's an absurd equation, and one is a public health measure, and the other is the institutionalized discrimination and stigmatization of a population, and this has absolutely nothing to do. And it's also the task of everyone I wouldn't say it's not necessarily the scholars, any informed public to make sure that this people are free to make those analogies, but also it's important to educate the public on whether those analogies make any sense or not.
Right. Absolutely. One of the things I find interesting about you is that you're in this field. You're Jewish. You grew up in an extremely Catholic country. of Spain in a small Jewish community in Madrid. What was it like growing up there with a Jewish identity in a very not Jewish place?
Well, yes. I mean, looking back, it was a really interesting experience. I was the only of two Jews in my school. The other Jew was my brother Marcos, who was in just one class above me. And interesting that in Spain there's mandatory religious instruction in schools, and that's paid by the church. That's actually also one of the agreements of the transition, that the church Catholic Church would retain its hold in public education. And so the question was asked, well, where do we put the Bears in what class? So this was a school, a concerted school that had many German-speaking kids from German-speaking families. And that's why my parents put us in there. So there were some Protestant kids in that school. So I don't know the reason why, but the question is that, okay, put the Jews together with the Protestants. And I got some Protestant religious instruction, which was interesting. And the reason why, I don't know to this day. Well, maybe there's some, there might be some, whatever, some things that where we have more in common, but I'm actually, I doubt it. But anyway, that's one of the many anecdotes I can tell you about growing up as a Jewish kid in Madrid.
How did that sort of experience, did it feed your Judaism, being just you and your brother in school and being sort of put with the Protestants in a Catholic, in a Catholic system like that?
I would say, look, it triggered many questions because I come from a family background that is German Jewish, fairly assimilated, at least in my family, because from my mother's side, it was much more assimilated than my father's side. But usually, it's the mother who has the main role in I mean, this was the case. So it was more when our exposure to family in Argentina, when we went there over the holidays, when I was more exposed to Judaism than at my home. Spain at that time, the Jewish community was mainly formed by Sephardic Moroccan Jews that had immigrated in the 60s and 70s. The big wave of Argentinian immigration came much later, in the late 80s and in the 90s, with the crisis there. So that changed. So when I was a kid, there weren't many Jewish children with that same kind of Ashkenazi liberal background in the Jewish community in Madrid. So we were sort of a minority within a minority there. And definitely that sparked many questions. I would say that has to do with a kind of a search, with wanting to learn more about our family history, about the broader history, and as I said before, about questions of who we are, and about identity and memory. Yeah.
So it sounds like you've probably done like a deep genealogical dive into your family.
I did, and actually, when I had the chance to study abroad, because I did my undergrad in Madrid at the Universidad Complutense, there's this Erasmus exchange European program where you study 1 year in another European country, another country of the European Union, and I chose to go to Germany, and I went to the city of my grandparents, which is Leipzig, and that was really a fascinating experience. I took my courses there, and I did some digging of documents in the archives. I learned a lot about my grandfather, who was a lawyer, and then he was a judge in Leipzig and Dresden. And this was really interesting for me to have the opportunity to spend the entire year in the city of Leipzig, and these coincidences of life, that I ended up living in an apartment with 4 other students. 2 of them were Ethiopian, by the way, because the GDR had an interesting agreement with other so-called Marxist-Leninist countries, and this was right after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So this was just 3 years after the unification of Germany. The Ethiopians were still there. But this is a side note. Anyway, what I was going to say is that I was living on the same street my grandfather had lived as a student when he was studying law at the University of Leipzig in the Pfaffendorfer Straße.
That's incredible.
Yeah,
that's amazing. Well, and I think it's interesting to, for people to know, Leipzig is in the former East Germany, which is something that I think a lot of people may not know or, have realized. So that's part of where that, yes, it was post-unification, but there's still obviously heavy East German connection to the university at that point, I'm sure.
Right, and even in our university ID cards, the university, they changed the name during the GDR times after World War II to Karl Marx Universität Leipzig. So it was a Karl Marx Universität, but when I was studying there, they hadn't changed the IDs, and they had like crossed out with a black marker Karl Marx. So it would be again the Universität Leipzig that it had always been. So this kind of things were really like kind of symbolic of where the city and the region were at that time. It was very, very present.
It's a fascinating time to be there.
Yeah, it was great. Yeah.
It did. What was it like then, diving into your family history? 60 or so years, give or take, after they had fled.
Well, I would say I was deeply moved by what had happened, just by learning from the documents, by reading, for instance, when my grandfather was forcibly released from public service because of being Jewish in 1935. Just looking at the traces of Jewish life in the city of Leipzig, the horror of the fate of so many other Jewish families that were not as lucky as mine, that could emigrate, even with all the hardship that involved. But of course, it had nothing to do with those who stayed, and many of whom did not survive, or even some did survive the camps. But still, that was a completely different experience. And I would even say that when we talk about Holocaust survivors, I make that distinction. And also, my father never talks of himself as a survivor. And even if he lived in Germany, he lived through Kristallnacht, but they emigrated before the war started, before the ghettoization, and before the horror of the camps. So I think it's important to make that distinction. I think the term, I'm quite adamant about that. Survivor is, one has to qualify that definition. One has to be specific on that too. A Jewish refugee from Germany is not necessarily a survivor. It can be a survivor as well, because there were camps in Germany, not extermination camps, but concentration camps before. But in any case, back to your question, Loni, this. Just living there and seeing and experiencing this. The aftermath of what this was, and just being involved in also just going to events. And it was the 50th anniversary, 1993, of the bombings of the city of Leipzig. I went to that exhibit, and I was very curious to hear what people were saying. I think that 93, many people were still alive that had lived that at a young age.
Right.
And I could not overhear an old lady saying, "Oh, remember this place, and this was bombed, and this was so hard." And I was thinking to myself, well, definitely it was hard for you because the city was bombed. But what about the Jewish population that at that time was already part of it murdered or in concentration camps, right?
Yeah. Well, and again, it goes to as you've talked about, it goes to memories. It's and the power of memory, and it's not just the survivors of the camps or of Kristallnacht or of various stages, but it also, memory also impacts those people that lived in Leipzig and Dresden and survived those times, which were as problem not as problematic for them, but certainly if you survived that time in those cities, that's obviously also traumatic, and how memory impacts them. It's interesting sociology, I suppose.
Absolutely. And that my writing is very much about these questions, and also about these experiences, which I incorporate and try to theorize about what it means to have these different memories and memories overlapping, and how memories are passed on from one generation to the other, etc. Yeah.
It's fascinating. It's fascinating questions, and I think we're very lucky to have you answering them. But we will end on a slightly lighter note than some of the ground we covered. And in your email to me, you sort of you teased this, so I'm glad you're a listener and you know what's coming. Last two questions. What is your favorite Jewish food?
Well, here in St. Paul, where I live, my favorite Jewish food is the Reubens and the matzo soup from Caesar.
Excellent choice.
I go there very often. And let me say this. My wife likes the place, doesn't like so much the food. I like the place and I love the food. So I go there with my friend and colleague Joe Eggers from the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. Whenever I can now, we order food and we eat it in a social distant manner at the center. And so this is my favorite Jewish food. Absolutely.
Is there a favorite Jewish food from home, either Madrid or Argentina, that that may be a little harder to come by here in the Upper Midwest?
There's definitely harder to come by with the Sephardic Jewish food, which I like from my Sephardic Jewish friends in Spain.
Okay.
Like the alfina, which is sort of a stew, which is wonderful. I didn't grow up that. I don't have a family connection with it, but I love it. I love to eat it. I don't know if you can find it here. I haven't come across it, but I must say I have a direct connection with the matzo soup because my dad, when he went to Argentina, he brought it from his sister-in-law who had learned it from his mother. So he brought the matzo soup in the suitcase from Argentina every time he traveled. And then my mom cooked it in Madrid. So that's my sort of umbilical, right?
Yes, I would say so. I mean, listen, and you talk about memory in your work. So much of food is tied to memory, also. So
yes,
absolutely, that's fantastic. And what is your favorite Jewish holiday?
I think it's Pesach. I know it's kind of a standard for many, but I love Pesach. I love the message, the sort of revolutionary message, the message of liberation, and it has Jewish and universal implication. Pesach is a wonderful, and I'm also a big fan of rituals. I'm not a religious person, but I love rituals, and the Seder is the ritual.
Oh yes,
par excellence. So I think Pesach. That's the reason why I love it.
Well, absolutely. Well, Alejandro Baer, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your knowledge. Thank you for the important work that you're doing at the U, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
The Who the Folk podcast is part of the Jew Folk Podcast Network, a product of Jew Folk Inc. Please subscribe, rate, and review the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you have suggestions for other podcast guests, please email them to me at editor@tcjewfolk.com. For our other shows, check out tcjewfolk.com/podcast.